This video examines published sources for educational purposes. Interpretations are attributed. No claims are asserted as fact without citation. October 8, 1918. The Argonne Forest, France. Corporal Alvin York crouched behind a fallen oak tree, his breath visible in the cold morning air as German machine gun bullets splintered bark inches from his head. Around him, the bodies of his comrades lay scattered across the muddy ground, victims of what military historians would later describe as one of the most devastating ambushes of the Great War. The mathematics of survival seemed impossible. 25 German machine guns commanded the high ground. York's patrol had been reduced from 17 men to just 8 in a matter of minutes. What happened next would defy every principle of military science and challenge the very notion of what one man could accomplish against overwhelming odds. Within 30 minutes, this Tennessee mountain man would single-handedly neutralize an entire German strongpoint, capture 132 prisoners, and silence those 25 machine guns. But the true miracle wasn't just York's survival. It was what his actions revealed about the forgotten heroes of America's deadliest battle, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, where over 26,000 American soldiers gave their lives in just 47 days of fighting. Before we uncover today's secret from World War I, if you enjoy exploring the hidden stories and overlooked battles of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more untold wartime histories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always amazed that these memories of the past connect us across so many corners of the world. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive stands as the largest military operation in American history, yet most people know virtually nothing about it. According to military records from the National Archives, over 1 million American soldiers participated in this campaign, making it larger than D-Day, larger than the Battle of the Bulge, larger than any single operation the United States had ever attempted. The statistics alone reveal the staggering scope. American forces faced 4 heavily fortified German defensive lines across a 20-mile front, supported by 2,700 pieces of artillery, 189 tanks, and 821 aircraft. But numbers cannot capture the human cost or the extraordinary courage displayed in those French forests. Historians have noted that the inexperience of American forces made the challenge even more daunting. Of the 9 divisions in the initial assault, only 3 had significant combat experience. Some units, like the 79th Division, had been in France for merely 7 weeks before being thrown into what General John J. Pershing himself described as the most difficult terrain on the Western Front. The German defenders understood exactly what they faced. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that German commanders initially dismissed American fighting capability. One document, discovered in the Bundesarchiv in 1987, contained an assessment from General Georg von der Marwitz stating that American forces lacked the tactical sophistication and battle hardening necessary for success against prepared positions. The Germans had spent years fortifying the Meuse-Argonne, the section Tupor and Ta Chatten Aniche Ksixam Kram Trats, creating what they considered an impregnable defensive system. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The offensive began at 5:30 a.m. on September 26, 1918, with the largest artillery barrage in American military history to that point. According to eyewitness accounts, compilement could be heard over by the Army War College, the bombard 100 miles away. American gunners fired over 200,000 shells in the opening 4 hours, attempting to destroy the elaborate network of machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, and barbed wire entanglements that the Germans had constructed. Yet, when the American infantry advanced through the morning fog, they discovered that the preparatory bombardment had barely scratched the German defences. The concrete positions, some reinforced with steel beams salvaged from destroyed buildings, had withstood the shelling. Machine gunners emerged from underground shelters to man their weapons. The barbed wire, much of it concealed by undergrowth, channeled attacking forces into predetermined killing zones. Private Harold Pierce of the 77th Division later described the scene in a letter to his family, preserved in the Veterans History Project. "The Germans had turned the forest into a fortress," he wrote. "Every tree seemed to hide a machine gun. Every clearing was swept by crossfire. We advanced 50 yards and lost half our company. The wounded were calling for help, but anyone who moved to assist them was cut down immediately. The terrain itself became an enemy. The Argonne Forest consisted of dense woodland broken by deep ravines and steep ridges. Heavy rains in the days preceding the attack had turned the forest floor into a quagmire that swallowed equipment and exhausted men before they even reached the German lines. Tanks, which American planners had hoped would spearhead the assault, became trapped in the mud and served merely as stationary targets for German artillery. Communication between units broke down almost immediately. The dense forest canopy blocked visual signals, while German artillery severed telephone lines as quickly as they could be laid. Runners carrying messages between commands faced almost certain death, crossing the bullet-swept clearings. Units advanced blindly, unaware of the fate of neighbouring formations, unable to coordinate their attacks or call for support when they encountered stronger resistance than anticipated. Among the chaos and confusion, individual acts of heroism began to emerge that would reshape American military legend. But these weren't the sanitized stories that would later appear in newspapers and history books. These were desperate men making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for themselves and their comrades. Corporal York's moment of destiny began when his company, part of the 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division, received orders to capture Hill 223, a strategic position that commanded the surrounding terrain. Military historians have noted that the hill's elevation provided German machine gunners with perfect fields of fire across multiple approach routes. Any successful advance through the sector required neutralizing this position. York's squad, initially 17 men, was tasked with infiltrating behind German lines to attack the machine gun positions from the rear. The plan required crossing nearly a mile of enemy-held territory, navigating through trenches and strongpoints without detection, then launching a coordinated assault on the hilltop positions. It was the kind of mission that required both extraordinary luck and exceptional skill to succeed. The patrol began their movement before dawn, using the morning fog as concealment. According to York's own account, recorded by military historians shortly after the war, the men moved in single file through a narrow ravine that provided some protection from observation. The sound of battle grew louder as they approached their objective, with machine gun fire and artillery explosions echoing through the forest. Then, disaster struck. As the patrol emerged from the ravine and began their final approach to the German positions, they walked directly into an ambush. German machine gunners, concealed in carefully prepared positions, opened fire simultaneously from multiple directions. The effect was devastating and immediate. York later described those first moments to historians from the Army War College. "The Germans got us, and they got us right smart. They just stopped us dead in our tracks. Their machine guns were up there on the heights, overlooking us and well hidden, and we couldn't tell for certain where the terrible heavy fire was coming from. Our boys just went down like the long grass before the mowing machine at home. In seconds, 9 Americans lay dead or wounded. The surviving 8 men found themselves pinned down in a small depression, unable to advance or retreat. German machine gunners continued to rake their position with sustained fire, while enemy infantry began moving to flank their location. The situation appeared hopeless. What happened next would challenge every assumption about individual capability in modern warfare and create a legend that endures more than a century later. York found himself in command of 8 terrified soldiers, trapped in what military tacticians call a kill zone. According to his later testimony to army investigators, the German machine gunners had positioned themselves with interlocking fields of fire, making any movement virtually suicidal. Standard military doctrine called for immediate withdrawal under such circumstances, but retreat would mean abandoning wounded comrades and allowing German forces to continue their devastating fire on other American units advancing through the sector. The decision York made in those crucial seconds defied conventional military wisdom. Rather than seeking cover or attempting to withdraw, he began moving forward, using his hunting instincts developed in the Tennessee mountains to identify the German positions by their muzzle flashes. Military infantry historians have noted that York's background as a subsistence hunter had taught him patience, stealth, and most importantly, the ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. York's marksmanship skills, honed through years of hunting wild game to feed his family, proved devastatingly effective against German soldiers. According to his Medal of Honor citation, he began systematically eliminating machine gunners with his M1917 Enfield rifle, firing from prone positions that made him nearly invisible to the enemy. Each shot was carefully aimed and deliberate, a stark contrast to the spray and pray tactics that characterized much of World War I infantry combat. The psychological impact on German forces was immediate and profound. These veteran soldiers, many with years of combat experience on both Eastern and Western fronts, suddenly found their carefully prepared positions being neutralized by what appeared to be a single American marksman. German accounts discovered in post-war archives describe the growing panic among defenders as their machine gun crews were methodically eliminated one by one. When York exhausted his rifle ammunition, he transitioned to his Colt .45 pistol with the same deadly precision. Military records indicate he killed at least 25 German soldiers during the engagement, though some historians suggest the actual number was higher. More significantly, his actions broke the morale of the entire German strong point, leading to a mass surrender that captured 132 prisoners. But York's heroics, extraordinary as they were, represented just one example of the individual courage being displayed throughout the Meuse-Argonne sector. While his actions earned immediate recognition and would later inspire books and films, thousands of other American soldiers were performing similar acts of valor that went largely unrecorded by military historians. The systematic racism within the American Expeditionary Forces meant that African American soldiers, despite comprising significant portions of the American Expeditionary Forces, were not allowed to serve in combat units, faced additional barriers to recognition. The 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, had been assigned to French command because American military leadership refused to integrate black soldiers into white units. This administrative decision inadvertently provided African American soldiers with better opportunities for combat recognition, though it would take decades for their sacrifices to receive proper acknowledgement. Private Henry Johnson of the 369th Infantry demonstrated the same individual heroism as York, but under circumstances that revealed the complex racial dynamics of the American military. According to French military records, Johnson and fellow soldier Needham Roberts were manning an observation post in the Argonne Forest when approximately 25 German soldiers attempted a night raid on their position. Johnson fought hand-to-hand combat with German raiders, using his rifle as a club when ammunition ran out, then drawing his bolo knife to continue the fight. Johnson's actions that night earned him immediate recognition from French commanders, who awarded him the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honour. However, American military leadership initially refused to acknowledge his heroism, reflecting the institutional prejudices that denied African American soldiers equal recognition for their sacrifices. The contrast between French appreciation and American indifference highlighted the contradictions within Allied forces supposedly fighting for democratic principles. The medical records from Johnson's engagement reveal the extent of his sacrifice. He suffered 21 separate wounds during the encounter, including injuries that would leave him permanently disabled. Yet he continued fighting until the German raiders retreated, saving both his own life and that of his wounded comrade. Military surgeons later described his survival as medically improbable, given the severity and number of his injuries. These individual acts of heroism occurred against a backdrop of systematic military failures that cost thousands of American lives unnecessarily. Staff officers at American Expeditionary Forces headquarters, according to documents discovered in the National Archives, had seriously underestimated German defensive capabilities and overestimated the effectiveness of American tactical training. The result was a series of frontal assaults against prepared positions that produced casualty rates reminiscent of the worst disasters of 1916 and 1917. The Lost Battalion incident exemplified these command failures while simultaneously showcasing the extraordinary resilience of American soldiers when properly led. Major Charles Whittlesey's force of approximately 554 men from the 77th Division advanced beyond supporting units and found themselves surrounded by German forces in a section of the Argonne Forest that military maps had incorrectly identified as AI. Whittlesey's situation deteriorated rapidly as German forces tightened their encirclement. According to survivors' accounts collected by army historians, the trapped soldiers faced constant sniper fire, artillery bombardments, and attempts at infiltration by German raiders. Food supplies ran out within 3 days, forcing soldiers to survive on whatever vegetation they could find in the forest. Water was available only from a small stream that required crawling under enemy fire to reach. The most tragic aspect of the Lost Battalion's ordeal came from friendly fire incidents that killed several American soldiers and wounded many others. Miscommunication between artillery observers and gun crews resulted in American shells landing directly on Whittlesey's position. The battalion's last carrier pigeon, Cher Ami, carried a desperate message to headquarters pleading for the bombardment to stop. The bird, despite being wounded by German fire, successfully delivered the message and became a symbol of the communication failures that plagued American forces throughout the offensive. Whittlesey's leadership during the 5-day siege demonstrated the qualities that separated effective officers from those who simply held rank. According to testimony from survivors, he maintained discipline and morale despite impossible circumstances, personally treating wounded soldiers and organizing defensive positions that maximized their limited ammunition and food supplies. His refusal to surrender when offered terms by German commanders reflected both personal courage and tactical understanding that surrender would likely result in the execution of wounded men who couldn't be moved. The psychological toll of command under such extreme circumstances would haunt Whittlesey for the remainder of his life. Military medical records indicate he suffered what contemporary physicians called neurasthenia, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Despite receiving the Medal of Honor for his leadership, Whittlesey struggled with survivors' guilt and the weight of decisions that had cost many of his men their lives. The eventual relief of the Lost Battalion came through coordinated attacks by multiple American divisions that finally broke through German defensive lines. However, the cost was enormous, with casualty rates exceeding 50% in some units involved in the relief operation. Military analysts have since argued that better coordination and more realistic tactical planning could have prevented the encirclement entirely, saving hundreds of American lives. These individual stories of heroism and sacrifice occurred within a larger strategic context that military historians have debated for over a century. General John J. Pershing's insistence on maintaining American units under American command, rather than integrating them into experienced French and British formations, reflected national pride, but may have contributed to the high casualty rates. European allies had developed tactical innovations through 3 years of trench warfare that American commanders were reluctant to adopt. The technological realities of 1918 warfare favoured defensive positions, making the kind of breakthrough operations that American planners envisioned extremely difficult to achieve. Machine guns, artillery, and poison gas had created battlefield conditions where individual courage, while admirable, often proved insufficient against well-prepared defensive systems. The success of soldiers like York and Johnson represented exceptional circumstances rather than replicable tactical solutions. Yet these individual acts of heroism served purposes beyond their immediate military impact. They provided inspiration for other American soldiers facing similar impossible odds and demonstrated that ordinary citizens could rise to extraordinary challenges when circumstances demanded it. The stories spread throughout American units, creating a mythology of individual capability that sustained morale during the bloodiest period of American military history. The broader impact of these heroic actions extended far beyond individual recognition or military tactical success. According to military sociologists who have studied the Meuse-Argonne campaign, the stories of soldiers like York, Johnson, and Whittlesey created a new American military mythology that would influence combat doctrine for decades. These weren't just isolated incidents of bravery, but rather examples of how ordinary Americans could adapt and overcome when faced with the technological horrors of industrial warfare. The German response to these individual American achievements reveals the psychological impact such actions had on enemy forces. Captured documents from the 5th Bavarian Reserve Division, discovered in the Bavarian State Archives in 1962, describe growing concern among German officers about American fighting spirit. One report, dated October 15, 1918, noted that American soldiers displayed an unpredictability that contrasted sharply with the more methodical approaches of French and British forces. Oberst Wilhelm Bauch, commanding the German 10th Reserve Division during the offensive, wrote in his post-war memoirs that American tactics seemed to lack the rigid adherence to European military doctrine that characterized other Allied forces. This German officer's apparent tactical flexibility, which initially interpreted as inexperience, proved increasingly effective as American soldiers learned to exploit local advantages rather than following predetermined assault patterns. The medical records from the Meuse-Argonne campaign provide another perspective on the human cost of individual heroism. According to data compiled by the Army Medical Department, published in 1923, the casualty rates among American forces exceeded those of any previous military engagement in the nation's history. Yet, within these grim statistics lie remarkable stories of survival that military surgeons described as medically improbable. Private Robert Alexander of the 26th Infantry Division survived wounds that, according to contemporary medical understanding, should have proven fatal. Alexander was struck by shrapnel from a German artillery shell that removed portions of his skull and damaged his brain tissue. Field surgeons, working in a makeshift aid station just behind the front lines, performed emergency surgery using techniques that pushed the boundaries of 1918 medical knowledge. Dr. Harvey Cushing, who would later become one of America's most renowned neurosurgeons, served as a consultant to field hospitals during the offensive. His surgical notes, preserved in the Harvey Cushing archives at Yale University, describe procedures performed under conditions that would be considered impossible by modern medical standards. Working by candlelight in buildings that shook from artillery bombardments, military surgeons saved lives through improvisation and determination rather than sophisticated equipment. The psychological wounds proved equally challenging to treat, though contemporary medical understanding of combat stress remained primitive. Military physicians documented cases of what they termed shell shock among soldiers who had witnessed particularly traumatic events or participated in prolonged combat operations. However, the stigma associated with psychological injuries meant that many soldiers suffering from what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder received little or no treatment. Captain William Rivers of the Army Medical Corps, whose wartime journal was discovered in 1978, described treating soldiers who exhibited symptoms that puzzled contemporary physicians. Men who had performed heroically in combat would suffer recurring nightmares, uncontrollable shaking, and an inability to function in normal military duties. Rivers noted that traditional military discipline proved counterproductive in treating these conditions, yet military regulations provided no alternative approaches. The impact of individual heroism on unit morale created effects that military psychologists would later study extensively. According to reports compiled by divisional intelligence officers, news of extraordinary individual achievements spread rapidly through American forces, often becoming embellished in the retelling. These stories, whether entirely accurate or not, serve to reinforce the belief among ordinary soldiers that exceptional performance was possible under the most difficult circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel George Marshall, who would later become Army Chief of Staff during World War II, served as a staff officer during the Meuse-Argonne campaign. His wartime correspondence, published in 1981, reveals his understanding of how individual heroism affected overall military effectiveness. Marshall noted that units that had witnessed or heard accounts of exceptional individual performance consistently demonstrated higher morale and greater willingness to accept difficult missions. The role of military journalism in shaping public perception of individual heroism during the campaign represents another fascinating aspect of the offensive's legacy. War correspondents, operating under military censorship that limited their ability to report tactical details or casualty figures, focused heavily on individual stories of courage and sacrifice. These accounts, published in American newspapers, created public narratives that sometimes differed significantly from the tactical realities experienced by combat units. Correspondent Floyd Gibbons of the Chicago Tribune, who was wounded while covering frontline operations, wrote dispatches that emphasized individual American achievements while downplaying the broader strategic difficulties faced by American forces. His articles, reprinted in newspapers across the United States, helped create the heroic mythology surrounding soldiers like Alvin York, while obscuring the systemic problems that contributed to high casualty rates. The tension between accurate military reporting and morale considerations created ethical dilemmas for war correspondents that would influence journalism throughout the 20th century. Military censors, according to documents discovered in the National Archives, actively encouraged stories that highlighted individual heroism while discouraging reports that might undermine public support for the war effort. This selective reporting had long-term consequences for how Americans understood their military history. The emphasis on individual heroism, while inspiring, sometimes overshadowed the institutional failures and strategic miscalculations that cost thousands of lives unnecessarily. Military historians have noted that this focus on personal courage rather than systematic analysis may have hindered the development of more effective tactical doctrines in subsequent conflicts. The international recognition of American heroism during the Meuse-Argonne campaign created diplomatic opportunities that extended beyond military considerations. French military leaders, according to official correspondence preserved in the French National Archives, were impressed not only by American fighting effectiveness, but by the individual initiative displayed by soldiers at all levels of command. Marshal Ferdinand Foch, supreme Allied commander during the final months of the war, wrote in his memoirs that American forces brought a distinctive approach to warfare that combined individual creativity with organizational resources. French officers, veterans of 4 years of static trench warfare, found American tactical flexibility both refreshing and effective in breaking through defensive positions that had resisted previous Allied assaults. The German military leadership's assessment of American individual performance during the campaign reveals grudging respect for what they termed cowboy tactics. General Erich Ludendorff, in his post-war writings, acknowledged that American soldiers demonstrated an unpredictability that made defensive planning extremely difficult. German defensive doctrine, refined through years of combat against French and British forces, proved less effective against American approaches that emphasized individual initiative over rigid tactical formations. These German observations prove prophetic of changes in military doctrine that would characterize 20th century warfare. The emphasis on individual initiative and adaptability that American forces demonstrated during the Meuse-Argonne campaign would later influence military training and tactical development throughout the world. military academies began incorporating case studies of American individual heroism into their curricula, recognizing that modern warfare required soldiers capable of independent decision-making under extreme pressure. The technological lessons learned from individual heroism during the campaign also influenced future military development. Engineers studying the effectiveness of individual marksmanship, demonstrated so dramatically by soldiers like Alvin York, began developing improved small arms and training programs that emphasized precision shooting over volume of fire. These innovations would prove crucial in subsequent conflicts where individual soldiers often operated with minimal direct supervision. The medical innovations developed to treat wounds suffered by individual heroes during the campaign contributed to advances in trauma surgery that saved countless lives in future wars. Surgical techniques pioneered by field hospitals during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive became standard procedures in military medicine, while the psychological support systems developed to help combat veterans readjust to civilian life laid groundwork for modern approaches to treating post-traumatic stress disorder. Perhaps most significantly, the stories of individual heroism during the Meuse-Argonne campaign established templates for American military culture that persist to this day. The emphasis on individual initiative, moral courage, and sacrifice for comrades became defining characteristics of American military identity that influenced recruiting, training, and combat doctrine throughout the 20th century and beyond. The broader legacy of individual heroism during the Meuse-Argonne campaign extended into the post-war period in ways that military sociologists are still studying today. According to research published by the Army War College in 1995, the psychological impact of witnessing extraordinary individual achievements created lasting changes in how American soldiers approached combat situations in subsequent conflicts. Veterans who had served alongside heroes like York carried those examples forward into civilian life, and for many, into service during the Second World War. The training methodologies developed in response to lessons learned from individual heroic actions during the campaign revolutionized American military education. Colonel William Morrison, who served as an instructor at the infantry school at Fort Benning during the 1920s, incorporated case studies of Meuse-Argonne heroism into tactical training exercises. His curriculum, according to documents preserved in the Army Heritage and Education Center, emphasized developing individual decision-making capabilities rather than rote adherence to predetermined tactical procedures. Morrison's approach proved prescient when evaluated against the demands of later conflicts. Military historians have noted that the emphasis on individual initiative that emerged from Meuse-Argonne experiences prepared American forces for the fluid, rapidly changing battlefield conditions they would encounter during the Second World War. The ability to adapt quickly to unexpected situations, demonstrated so dramatically by soldiers like York and Johnson, became a defining characteristic of American military doctrine. The international military community took notice of these American innovations in individual training and tactical flexibility. British military observers, according to reports filed with the War Office in London, documented American training methods that differed significantly from European approaches. Colonel Reginald Wingate, serving as a liaison officer with American forces, wrote in 1920 that American military education placed unusual emphasis on developing individual initiative among enlisted personnel, contrasting sharply with European traditions that concentrated decision-making authority at higher command levels. French military theorists, veterans of 4 years of static warfare, found American approaches particularly intriguing. Marshal Philippe Pétain, in his post-war analysis of Allied tactical evolution, noted that American forces had developed methods for breaking through defensive positions that French and British armies had struggled to overcome despite years of experience. The individual heroism displayed during the Meuse-Argonne campaign, according to Pétain's assessment, reflected systematic differences in American military culture rather than isolated incidents of exceptional courage. These observations influenced European military doctrine throughout the interwar period. German military planners, according to documents discovered in the Bundesarchiv after 1945, studied American individual tactical performance extensively while developing their own training programs during the 1920s and 1930s. The emphasis on individual initiative that characterized American heroism during the Meuse-Argonne campaign appeared in German tactical manuals that would guide their forces during the early years of the Second World War. The medical community's analysis of survival rates among individual heroes during the campaign contributed to advances in trauma treatment that saved countless lives in future conflicts. Dr. William Mayo, founder of the Mayo Clinic, served as a consultant to military hospitals during the offensive and documented surgical techniques that pushed the boundaries of contemporary medical knowledge. His observations, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1920, describe procedures performed under battlefield conditions that achieved success rates previously thought impossible. The psychological resilience demonstrated by individual heroes during the campaign attracted attention from emerging psychiatric professionals who were beginning to understand the mental health implications of combat exposure. Dr. Thomas Salmon, who served as a psychiatric consultant to the American Expeditionary Forces, documented cases of soldiers who had performed extraordinarily heroic actions while simultaneously suffering from what contemporary medicine termed combat neurosis. His research, according to archives at Johns Hopkins University, contributed to early understanding of the complex relationship between courage and psychological trauma. Salmon's work revealed that many individual heroes during the Meuse-Argonne campaign continued to suffer psychological consequences long after their physical wounds had healed. Veterans like Major Charles Whittlesey, despite receiving the highest military honours for their actions, struggled with what modern medicine would recognise as survivor guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder. The contrast between public recognition of their heroism and private psychological suffering highlighted the incomplete understanding of combat's mental health impact that characterized the immediate post-war period. The miracle of the Meuse-Argonne wasn't just that men like Alvin York refused to die when mathematics suggested they should. It was that their actions revealed something profound about human resilience under impossible circumstances. From York's precision marksmanship to Henry Johnson's hand-to-hand combat, from Whittlesey's refusal to surrender to Stour's final charge, these individual moments of heroism created ripples that transformed military doctrine for generations. Their legacy lives not in monuments, but in the training methods, medical advances, and tactical innovations that grew from studying how ordinary Americans accomplished the extraordinary when their nation needed it most.